Alors, bonjour tout le monde. Ouais, je vais me reculer un petit peu. Merci d'être là. Alors, je me présente, je suis Geneviève Paquette, directrice du groupe de recherche et d'intervention sur les adaptations sociales de l'enfance, le GRISE, qui est un centre de recherche financé de l'Université de Sherbrooke. J'en profite pour soit vous rappeler la mission du GRISE ou soit vous la présenter. Alors, le GRISE a pour mission de produire des connaissances scientifiques utiles à l'intervention sur tout le continuum du développement des jeunes, de la petite enfance jusqu'au début de l'âge adulte, en se préoccupant évidemment de leur adaptation. Le GRISE rassemble 30 membres réguliers, 30 membres chercheurs réguliers de l'Université de Sherbrooke, 15 membres associés. Actuellement, on a 90 membres étudiants, 6 membres chercheurs au postdoctorat. Le GRISE comporte aussi, abrite 4 chaires de recherche du Canada et 2 équipes de recherche financées, notamment par le FQRSC. Les personnes intéressées peuvent consulter notre site web à grise.ca. Alors, pour plus d'informations. Alors, je suis heureuse de vous voir aujourd'hui assister en ligne ou en présence à notre première conférence de l'année académique, une conférence donc à saveur internationale qui est organisée sous l'égide du GRISE en collaboration avec la Chaire de recherche du Canada sur le vivre-ensemble, les médias numériques et les enfants, vision écosystémique, dont Caroline Fitzpatrick, membre du GRISE, est la titulaire. Cette conférence rejoint 2 thèmes fédérateurs de la recherche à l'Université de Sherbrooke, soit le vivre ensemble, culture, pluralité, gouvernance et équité, et l'ère numérique, formation et organisation intelligente. Je tiens donc à remercier toutes les personnes, dont les professionnels qui ont facilité l'organisation de cet événement. Tout d'abord, Mylène Villeneuve-Cyr, qui est coordonnatrice du GRISE, qui est juste ici. Julien A. Basile, coordonnateur pour le thème fédérateur du Vivre ensemble, et Gabriel Richard, qui est co-coordonnateur pour le thème fédérateur de l'ère numérique. Alors, quelques consignes logistiques, s'il vous plaît. Prenez le temps de mettre votre téléphone au mode silencieux. Toujours important de le rappeler en cette ère numérique. Et je vous signale aussi que la présentation sera enregistrée, donc pourra être réécoutée. Notamment, je sais qu'il y a plusieurs personnes étudiantes ou encore personnes enseignantes qui devront quitter un peu plus tôt pour aller à leur cours. Alors, ils pourront quand même voir la fin de la présentation et la période d'échange avec Dr. Barr, puisque ce sera enregistré. Donc, ne vous sentez pas mal là, lorsque arrivera l'heure de quitter. Là, Dr. Barr est au courant qu'il y a de l'enseignement qui se fait dans une université, je l'ai avisé. Alors, ne soyez pas gênés. Pour les autres, il y aura une période d'échange qui est prévue avec Dr. Barr. Vous pourrez vous exprimer en français ou en anglais. Caroline Fitzpatrick pourra faire la traduction. Et on prendra évidemment là, des questions, des commentaires en présence et aussi en ligne. Alors, n'oubliez pas en terminant que nous avons une autre conférence demain, même heure, même local, mais pas le même lien Teams. Alors, si vous voulez assister à cette conférence demain, il faudra donc prendre le bon lien Teams là, qui se retrouve sur les internets, comme on dit. Alors, sans plus tarder, je cède la parole à la professeure Fitzpatrick pour qu'elle nous présente sa collègue Dr. Barr et je vous souhaite une bonne conférence et merci à l'avance à Dr. Barr.
Donc, merci beaucoup, Geneviève. C'est mon immense plaisir aujourd'hui de présenter la professeure Rachel Barr. Originaire de la Nouvelle-Zélande, la professeure Barr est professeure en psychologie à l'Université de Georgetown à Washington. C'est aussi une collègue et une mentor qui m'inspire énormément. La professeure Barr est leader international dans la recherche sur la mémoire et l'apprentissage des tout-petits. Et ses travaux ont permis de mieux comprendre pourquoi les enfants comprennent moins bien à travers leurs interactions avec les écrans qu'avec des interactions en personne. La professeure Barr est aussi responsable de la création du consortium CAFE, Comprehensive Assessment of Family Media Exposure Consortium, qui est un groupe qui a permis de développer des nouveaux outils pour mesurer les habitudes médiatiques des familles. Donc, grâce à son immense contribution scientifique, la professeure Barr a aussi récemment mérité le poste de présidente au International Congress for Infant Studies. So, Rachel, it's really my tremendous pleasure to welcome you. Sans plus tarder, je vous demande de l'accueillir chaleureusement.
Hello. Je ne parle pas français, désolé, but thank you very much for having me here. Let me just find my screen. And so we're going to talk about growing up in the digital world. And this is kind of a complicated thing for children to do. I have been thinking about this, though, since 1999. And so things have changed very much over the past 20 to 25 years. And so it's been a fascinating thing to think about how all of these changes have affected young children. So the thing is that we are all surrounded by screens all the time. This one person didn't get the memo and decided to look at the real world. But I say this facetiously, so should we be worried? Should we be worried about this immersion of children in this screen-based world? And in fact, Swiss scientist Konrad Gesner worried about handheld information devices causing confusing and harmful consequences. So people have definitely been concerned, but Dr. Gesner was in 1565, and the concern that he had at the time was about the invention of books. Not allowed to bang. And so books, he was worried about right from the very beginning. And so this idea that every time we have a new technological advance, it may change the way we think, change the way we interact with the world, is not a new idea. So today I'd like to focus on a talk in 3 different sections. Feel free to, I'm going to cover what is the children's digital environment like, what can children learn from media, and then focus in on video chat. So you can feel free to ask questions at the end about any of these 3 sections, but just so that you know that this is what is going to be coming. So Caroline just mentioned that we work together in the Cafe Consortium, and this group actually started back in 2015, and we were interested as a group to try and examine how children were growing up, but not to just ask how much screen time, but to more comprehensively think about what they were learning, how they were learning, and with whom they were learning from media. We wanted to look at both potential positive impacts or enhancing ways that media could benefit very young children. This is children under 5, and also ways that technology may interfere with their learning. So far we have groups all over collecting data with the same measure that we developed together. And the reason I'm here is because of the work that Caroline did in Nova Scotia and now is obviously at Sherbrooke. And so I am delighted to always hear about this project and to be collaborating on it. But what I wanted to do is talk about why we developed it together, what are the challenges we're trying to solve, and then give you some illustrations of how this measure can be helpful in multiple different places. So one challenge, if we want to go beyond screen time, is that we need to think about content and context of exposure. So one way that we have done that is develop a time use diary. And what you can see here is this is toddlers and preschoolers. This is a 24-hour diary. Toddlers in light blue sleep more than the preschoolers. This is good. It's sort of like a sanity check. And children who are preschoolers spend more time in childcare. But in this light orange here, both toddlers and preschoolers spend some of their day every day with media. So we know, though, that how they're spending this time, that the content matters. So from many, many different studies, we know that educational media like Sesame Street can promote outcomes. And this is television-based media. We know a lot less about apps and other forms of media, which we'll get to in a moment. But television, if it's designed well, can promote learning, pro-social skills, even into high school. Non-entertainment media, not so much. So things like SpongeBob have neither a positive nor negative effect on actual memory and learning, and they might have a short-term negative effect on working memory. So they're sort of neutral to not great. The category, though, that is surprisingly more problematic for young children is adult-directed or background TV. So this is television that is not made for young children. It's not necessarily violent, but things like Jeopardy here, or the weather or sports, it is just totally incomprehensible to very young children. And then finally, violence, we know from thousands of studies, is negatively associated with outcomes. So I'm not going to talk about violence anymore. But we are going to focus in on educational media and this background media. And background media matters for not just that the babies don't understand the content, but because the attention of the adult is drawn away from the child. So one, the information is meaningless. Two, the adult is not focusing. So here we have sort of COVID working conditions for many families. And here, though, this seems fairly innocuous. The TV is on in the background, the parent and the child are interacting with each other. But think about that Jeopardy show, and every now and then there's going to be a ding, okay, or any game show. And whenever there's a ding, the baby will stop playing and turn to look at that screen, only to find it is still totally meaningless. Then the parent, though, will hear this really interesting question on Jeopardy and try to think of the answer, okay? While the parent is trying to think of the answer, the baby is trying to get the parent's attention, and the parent is going to be slowed down. So the child is at a double disadvantage because their play is interrupted and less complex, and their parent and caregiver is slower to respond. So this type of media also is the type of media that is on many hours a day. So in the US, this is back in 2012, TV was on almost all the time in 42% of homes. So we often think about like the screen media that children are being exposed to directly, but we also need to consider this indirect exposure. And luckily, that's what CAFE allows us to do. And this indirect exposure is really called technoference. And just to give you just another quick, sorry. Anybody ever seen that before, right? So you could see that my face suddenly goes still. So compared to the TV example, the cell phone example is different. I might be getting many, many notifications, about 100 at least a day, and I'll just quickly check them. I've got a notification here that I have to give a talk at 12. So it's very good that I interrupted our back and forth to check that I had a notification, right? But this is happening throughout the day, many, many times a day to children. So these things collectively are called technoference. So where technology is interfering with interactions with young children. And about 50% of parents say that technology interrupts their time with their child at least 3 times a day. So that's probably an underestimate. On the other hand, parents discuss the challenge of their attention being divided between work, home, social connections when the world is in their lap. And now just sort of ramp that up 100 times or 1,000 times during the COVID pandemic. So we have this sort of challenge and tension of what technology can provide us and how it may interfere. So using back to this time use diary, what we're able to draw out of this time use diary is whenever children are in different activities, down the side here it's sort of hard to read, but this says play and recreation inside, and the light blue is showing the amount of time that when children are playing inside, parents are using their own devices. So playing inside, playing outside. When children are using their own media, parents may be using a different device, and during meal times. So this is happening, parent device use is happening quite consistently throughout the day. And background media, just having that TV on, is more during play inside and meal times. So we have a little bit of a picture there of this background media. The next thing that is a challenge, if we're going to develop a tool to measure, is what is happening on our devices. If I ask you to recall, just start thinking through your day and think about the amount of time and the number of activities and the number of apps that you have done, and just quickly start writing them down. Just does anyone have an idea that maybe it may be quite challenging to do that, right? Because there are multiple brief bursts of time. So you have 1 or 2 minutes here, a notification there, and it's very hard to keep track of all of those things. So we worked with this company, Methodic, and they developed an app for Androids. We're trying to get it on the Apple. And what this app does is that every 15 seconds, your phone will send information to Google and to Apple. And it will send information through an API. So this is happening all the time. You're sharing this information anyway. And what our app does is we request, could we share that information with us for a limited period of time? And what it says is how long people are using different apps, and you can use that on a parent device, or you can use that on a child tablet as well. And so when Jenny Radeski and her group looked at this, she asked for self-report versus this Chronicle app. And what she found is that there was a group of parents who were under-reporting their use. That's what most of us would have expected. There was an equal number of people who were over-reporting their use, and a group in the middle. And these ranges these were like half-hour blocks. So people are generally not very accurate at reporting what their children were doing on the devices. So this app kind of takes the guesswork out of it. So we've got the time use diary for content and context. We've got the app to track what people are, what apps they're using on their phone and for how long. And these are sort of the types of apps that you can look at. So you can take out and see, well, what are children doing? YouTube is really the biggest one. I can't see a cursor on here, but you can see that number 5. It is a high use one. And when this was collected a couple of years ago, Crashy Cops was big in the preschool tablet use world. Okay, but it gives us a little bit more of an idea of what children are doing on their on tablets. And I mentioned before that we know a lot about television, but we know really relatively little about how children are interacting with apps. And of course, there are hundreds of thousands of apps available, and whenever you register an app, you can just pick the category educational. This is going to be a big surprise to everybody. All of these apps that are tagged as educational are not educational, right? So we really know very little about how they're interacting with apps, and there are some that are beautifully made, right? There are some that are beautifully designed and should likely have the same trajectory as things like Sesame Street. There are others that are poorly designed, and as a group, the Cafe group, we're trying to figure out how we could more easily categorize them rather than looking through each one at a time. But basically, not one tool is going to be able to answer growing up in the digital world, so we have all of them. And what we're working on right now across these multiple different groups across the country is trying to take different aspects of these different devices to get a more comprehensive view. So what I would like to argue is that working together as a group has this advantage, this synergy, in that we're able to use the same tool and to examine questions about media use across different countries, across different languages, across different populations. So I'll just give you a couple of examples of findings from the cafe group so far, just to give you an idea of what I mean. So in Italy, Francesca Balagamba looked at sleep in media. So there was a sleep inventory that is part of the cafe. She has the cafe media assessment, and she looked at media and sleep habits. And she found that when there were more devices available, there was later bedtime, less nighttime sleep, and more sleep during the daytime. And this is for children under 3. And the reason why that pattern is more problematic is that as children mature, typically they should be spending more time asleep at night and less during the daytime. And then it became even more so this delayed sleep onset if parents reported that they use this media to occupy the child and keep them busy. So why parents are using media is also important. So that's sleep in media. We can also, in Germany, they asked about play in media. So that still face that I just mentioned, what they did is they gave the cafe measure to the participants, and then in an experimental setup, they texted the parents. And we looked to see what sort of behaviours they were engaged in. So were they engaged in teaching, pedagogy, or were they engaged in being responsive? And all you really need to know about this one is this in the middle here is during the text. And you can see that pedagogy, and the orange and the blue is when the parents are being interrupted. Whenever they were interrupted, perhaps not surprisingly, they were less likely to teach, but they were definitely also less responsive. But again, imagine that happening about 100 times a day. The good news is children recovered very, very quickly from these interruptions, and parents, their responsiveness as well. But whenever we looked at parents who said they often use their phone in the cafe, this was more likely to be associated with general less pedagogical behaviour overall. So there's sort of carryover effects as well from media back to live interactions. So we have play, we have sleep, we have language, and this is from a group in Sweden. And in Sweden, what they looked at, because again, it's part of the cafe, we have a language measure as well. So this is the Swedish Child Development Index, a vocabulary measure. And what they found was if there was more screen time and if parents used digital media more when they were engaged in routines with their children, so more during bedtime, more during bath time, more during mealtime, this was associated with poorer language development, so interfering with language development. On the opposite side, we also saw positive enhancing strategies. So when there was parental strategies like turn taking, JME stands for joint media engagement, so they were engaging around media, reading, all of these were positively associated. So it doesn't just have to be the media itself that results in good or bad outcome, it's how the context in which it is being used. So we've got sleep, language, play. We've also got mood. So this is now from a group in the US. And what they looked at was they measured temperament and they measured these parenting practices. Do you use media to calm your child down? But what was really clever about this group is they had the MAC and then they added on, they had the media questionnaire from the cafe, and they added on ecological momentary assessment. So throughout the day, they texted the families and they said, hey, what are you doing? And if they had been doing, using media in the past hour, they asked, are you still using media with the child? If you've stopped, how hard was it for the child to transition away from the media? And what they found was that if parents were using media to calm the child down, if the child was having like a really sort of very excited about the world, and also if the child had a more difficult temperament, this was all associated with more difficulty of the child transitioning away from media. This is the thing that the parents report that is the most difficult thing. You use media, you want to take it away, you want to turn it off, and the child has, as in this title, a meltdown. right? So trying to figure out what are the things that are associated with those transitions, what predicts those transitions. And the nice thing about Sarah Coyne's work is that she is looking at this longitudinally. So she has had the cafe from when these babies were 1 through to now when they are 6 or 7. So we really can sort of start to see the trajectory across time and what might predict these difficult transitions over time. So then the pandemic happens, and parents are just, many of them lose their childcare. I don't know if any of you here are parents or on Zoom, and you lost your childcare during that time. It was a very, very, very challenging time. And at that time, that it would have, the time that they lost the childcare, they were trying to also keep their jobs. So they could work from home, which was great. They could have no childcare, and they could do both at the same time. So that was not an ideal situation. So 73% of parents, according to Harshorn et al., said their children were getting more screen time. Okay, so this is perhaps not surprising, the link between childcare and screen time, but what about the other contextual factors? And so now we come in with research from Sherbrooke. And what we can see now, so we've seen this link between sleep and media, and more media and more poorer sleep. We've seen this link between challenges in parenting and then more media as well. And then we add the pandemic. And so from the data collected in Nova Scotia, 56% of 3 to 5-year-olds were exposed to media before bedtime. And this media, I didn't know whether to do less or more, but if there was less media, the child had more a temperament that was, they had better effortful control. So it was easier for them to transition. Parents were using a more restrictive style and saying, no, we're not going to have media during bedtime. We have a different bedtime routine. The parents themselves use less media. And the somewhat surprising one that I would ask you later on is that when there was more children in the household, there was also less media at bedtime as well. So the point being, though, that this measure that we'd already found these different effects on mood, on sleep, on stress, were then able to be used and reported again in Sherbrooke. And this really beautiful data set that was collected heroically during the pandemic. Which brings me to this final slide here. So I mentioned that childcare, there was a change, and this was a big reported finding, that childcare was lost, screen time goes up. This has been reported in many different studies. But what was nice about the CAFE data set, this small data set, was that we were able to look at data collected before the pandemic, 2019, and then during different waves of the pandemic. So this is sort of the Omicron peak, and this is sort of Delta, if you want to think of it like that. I like to think of it in waves, not of data collection, but of the pandemic. But what we looked at is we asked parents, did they have daycare or not, or childcare? And this orange bar again is the one you're paying attention to. So for people who didn't lose their childcare, have any change in their childcare, media remained fairly constant. For the ones who had childcare, you'll see that that bar is a little bit narrower. So they had less when their children were in childcare. During, when they lost the childcare, which was really during summer of 2020, we see an increase. But by 2021, most people who have returned, childcare has returned. These were not days that the childcares were shut, but there's an increase in change in pattern over time. So not just a change that was during the pandemic, but a chronic change. This data set is too small for us to really definitively say that. However, and we also know that there was lots of different reasons why they used it. So what is happening now is that we're going to collate data from Nova Scotia, from Sweden, from New Zealand, from Israel, and from the US to try and look at this question a little bit more systematically with a much bigger data set using this questionnaire. So hopefully I have convinced you that this is a good idea. This practice, it takes a bit of time. Caroline and I have been working together for quite a long time, including 2 years of trying to get a data agreement that all of these countries would agree to. However, I think it optimizes data analysis, it optimizes expertise across different groups, and then everybody can have autonomy over their own research questions as well. So you have your own expertise and research question, and you can pull data across the group. So I think it's sort of a win-win, in my view, and hopefully Carolyn agrees. Okay, so that's the end of part one. I'm going to completely switch gears. So they're growing up in this milieu, and the question is, can they actually learn anything from these devices? This is like a good question, right? If we want to know if they're being affected, all these other things, but can they learn from them, the very basic question. So this is where I started many, many years ago, because I'm a memory researcher, and I wanted to know, could they learn from television? And then this, if any of you are familiar with the old-fashioned Sesame Street, one of these things is not like the other. This very old-school Sesame Street. That book in the corner there is not there by mistake, because books are 2D devices, just like our friend in 1565 said. It's going to be challenging for us to pick up information from those devices, and perhaps as difficult as from a tablet or a television or a mobile device. And there are findings that are consistent with that idea. But we treat children differently when they are with picture books. We share picture books with them much more and much more frequently than we share media. And so I think that we just want to keep that in mind when we're thinking about what can they learn and how can they learn and how can we support learning across all forms of media. And I would also argue that video chat is not that different. So video chat has, I'm going to tell you about some benefits of video chat, but there are also limitations because it's still a 2D device that operates in a very different way than our real world, as we have all found over the past few years. And as the hybrid, so on Zoom, this is a different experience than being in a room, right? And we all know this, even though all of the cues are available to us on the video chat as they are in live. So why would we also care if they can learn from media? Well, I would argue that it's really important for transfer of learning. If we want children to be taking information and then applying it out in the real world, we want to know how they're taking that information from various different devices. And this transfer of information across content and context, different places, arguably the entire bedrock of the educational system. And it is critical for us as humans and to engage in our day-to-day lives, and it's also central to all memory theories, that we're able to take information, encode it, and use it in new situations. So, how do you do this in babies? I started out with Harlene Hayne many, many years ago, and we used an imitation method. And I'm just going to demonstrate to you this method. So you just see something, and then I'm going to ask you to do something. And that's all it is. So I'm just going to ask you to raise your hands and put your hands down. Okay, good. Everybody has a working imitation system. It's a huge, huge, huge benefit to humans. And it's a huge benefit to researchers because we can use this non-verbal system that is very easy. And we didn't really, even if I'd just gone like this and said, your turn, without even any verbal instructions, you still may have also copied me, and children in fact do. We need to make sure though that they don't just copy, that they can't just figure stuff out on their own. And so we always have a control group that doesn't see the demonstrations. So theoretically, if you had not seen me do this, none of you in the room are spontaneously doing this right now. Okay, so you had to see me do this and then do this. So this is what the control is for. So what we did is we took 12, 15, and 18-month-olds, and we showed them a live model, a video model, and this control group. We showed them and came back 24 hours later. We showed them how 15 and 18-month-olds how to make a rattle and how to feed an animal, and these are the different steps, and we measured which of these steps the children imitated. The white is that control group. So the kids don't really figure out much on their own. And what we need to know is, did anybody copy significantly above that? And in fact, 15 and 18-month-olds do, whether or not they saw that on video or live. So they can learn from video. It's just that they learn a lot less. And this is because of this, what I have called this transfer deficit. There's difficulty taking the cues from a 2D world and transferring it into a 3D world. We developed another task for 2 to 3-year-olds to see if it goes away. And we developed this, if any of you have got refrigerator magnets, this is basically just the idea of you can just move refrigerator magnets and make them into a fish or a boat, and then we could program that also on a touchscreen. We were really trying to make it quite flat, but there were real objects that the children had to move. So again, they see a demonstration, they can see it on the touchscreen, we put the magnet board in, and then they can move around the real pieces. So it's all in the same space, so it's not a different size. All of those nice perceptual things are controlled because Peter Gerritston is a perception scientist and made that happen. So we have a video demonstration, a touchscreen demonstration, a 3D demonstration, and then children can do a 2D test or a 3D test. And we'll just see if this doesn't work, it doesn't matter. This, of course, is the poster child. And at the end, she says, I did it. But you can't hear the sound. But so she puts this together. We can measure this. This is the 2D test. We can do the same thing. It's a goldfish. So that's the group there in the white. If she saw it on the touchscreen, and she could do this on the touchscreen. This is if they saw it with basically the fridge magnets, and then they were tested with the fridge magnets. So no problems, again, if you don't change the dimension. They don't figure out how to put this thing together themselves in baseline, either on the touchscreen or with magnets. But in the middle, in the grey, is if they learn it from video, they show a deficit. If they learn it from the real magnets and to the 2D world, they show it. And if they go from 2D to 3D on the touchscreen, they show this deficit. And then just one more, just in case it's not a real thing. We looked at 15-month-olds, and we do a similar thing, and we press, this time it's just you press a little button and the duck goes quack, and you can do this whole cross experience again. And once again, if you don't change anything, they're good on the right-hand side. If you, at their baseline, they do not find that button by themselves, but in the middle, they learn significantly less. They do learn. That's the thing I think we want to really take away. They can learn, it's just harder. So then we tried to think, is there a way that we could support this learning? And again, we know a lot about picture book reading. We know a lot about how children can learn vocabulary and make huge gains from picture book learning. Oh, just had to show you. It's all the same, different ages, different tasks. There's always a deficit. We can ameliorate that by supporting learning in similar ways that we do in picture books. So how did we do that? We took this same task. Elizabeth Thack brought mothers and their 15-month-old babies, and she said you just have to teach how to, that this button is the same as this button. The only thing is you can't actually show them on both of it. You can only show them on one and somehow help them make that correspondence. This is that finding that I just showed you, the transfer deficit, so they learn less. This is that if nothing changes, they learn more. But this, in the green, is if you have a parent helping them. So you can dramatically support this learning if you have the parent doing those demonstration and guiding them. So the question is, though, what was it that improved the learning? Basically, it was parental scaffolding. So if parents used elaborate verbal input, if they were emotionally supportive and warm and responsive, and if they were structured in some way, this supported learning. These are all things key educational practices that we know are pivotal to children's learning. And I don't know if this is, oh, it doesn't. This was a beautiful video where this mother, she says, and this one is a cow, and this one is a cow, and they have back and forth joint attention. It's very, very warm. It is the perfect example. This is the only time I will ever get a result like this. So for the next 20 years, I'm going to still talk about this finding. 19, if they were higher quality interactions, the baby was 19 times as likely to do that transfer task. So I think there's huge potential in this joint media engagement, providing the supports that parents and caregivers and educators already know, but applying them to a digital context. So that's part 2. Children can learn from media. Children do grow up saturated with media. And the third thing is, why do we care about video chat? And the reason why we care about video chat is that it adds this social contingency, this back and forth. And so now you've got audio, you've got visual, and someone will respond to you in real time. So theoretically, this should be a lot better. And before Zoom, before many of us were doing this on a daily basis, many families were separated. So military families were separated, and in fact, Skype was developed by the military to have a safe encryption device, and was used very early on by military to stay in communication. Incarcerated parents often are separated and use video. Migrant parents, sometimes families when they're divorced, families that travel a lot, the parents that work a lot. Many, many families are impacted by distance, and video chat, even before the pandemic, was a good avenue. So we knew something about video chat before 2020, before March 2020, when we all went online. And in fact, 2016, Elizabeth McClure says, many young children today are geographically separated from their immediate or extended families, and remote communication is an important resource for them. Little did we know 4 years later that this would be such a dramatic tool for communication. Carolyn and I were just saying we had worked together for many years, and this is the first time that we've actually met in person, like literally years. So it is possible to have these ongoing communications. And when we asked parents in the DC area in 2015 why they use video chat, they said that they used it to communicate and see their family who are far away. So this is not surprising, but at that time, a lot of these parents had rules that their babies couldn't use any other type of media, but video chat was their exception. And subsequently, it has been demonstrated that children can learn more easily from video chat than pre-recorded video. So even at 18 months, if you video chat with an adult only 3 times, and then you meet them in real life, those 18-month-olds can recognize that person that they'd only seen on Zoom. I luckily also could recognize Carolyn when I saw her. So, but that is pretty remarkable that at 18 months with only 3 video chats that they can do this. A little bit younger, they can't. So there's something about 18 months there. They also imitate more from video chat than pre-recorded videos. By 2, they can learn more new words, and they can be soothed by an absent caregiver. Of course, this becomes really important in childcare settings, in NICU settings, and neonatal intensive care. Having voices, having video chats of parents can be quite good emotion regulators. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. And by 2.5, they can play hide and seek, find hidden objects from video chat, even though they can't do that if you show them on a pre-recorded video. So this is the power of this social contingency. So then COVID, and what we wanted to know was how was it this relationship, this grandparent-grandchild relationship, was actually very disrupted for obvious reasons during the pandemic, for health reasons to keep the grandparents safe, and at the time we didn't really know what was happening with babies either. And so in collaboration with others from Vanderbilt and South Dakota and Lafayette, Penn State and at Georgetown, we set up a survey to ask what parents and grandparents were doing during the early stages of the pandemic. And so we had about 800 grandparents and 800 parents, and they all had a child or grandchild between the ages 0 and 4. And we wanted to know about their video chat usage, and it was collected, like I said, in the summer of 2020. And what we found is that, indeed, grandparents did stay in touch with their grandchildren. And it wasn't just that they used this from time to time. During that time, almost 50% of them were video chatting with their grandchildren daily or a few times a week. And not surprisingly, as their grandchild got older, they spent more time doing this. And they engaged in a whole range of behaviours. So they asked questions, they played peekaboo, they had a lot of affection even across a screen. They did silly faces, they made each other laugh. And they said things like, I love connecting with my grandchildren. I live 4 hours away and the pandemic has prevented me from visiting as often as I'd like to visit. The benefit of video chatting with my grandchild is that I want him to know my face and my voice, and it makes my day when he smiles at me during our calls. In person, this I thought was sort of also interesting. She can only see me with the mask on. And we need to video chat more often so she can get to know me. I love connecting with her, and so on and so forth. The benefit of the video chat is being close to them. So this is kind of an irony, right? They were at 6 feet and they felt closer across the screen because they could see the baby and even, touch across the screen. So we looked at these survey findings, and we found that our outcome variable was how close did the grandparent perceive how close they were to their own grandchild. So that was the outcome. And we looked at grandparent age and education and child age. These things predicted closeness. If they were closer geographically, they felt closer, and that they'd seen their children in person. But even accounting for all these variables, the frequency of video chat, the quantity, and the quality of those interactions predicted how close they felt to those grandchildren during that very challenging time. The thing to note about this sample is that almost all of them, that was collected online during the pandemic, who has literally the bandwidth to do a survey, is people who had good internet connections and weren't having the internet cut off or finding it a burden to pay for the internet. So this was a benefit to families who had really good access to broadband during this time of separation. So just the last couple of sections, it's good to do surveys, but I am a big believer in multiple methods, and so we also used a observational study, and we collected an observational study before COVID and then during COVID. And the study that we collected before COVID was just with 25 parents, and we went into their homes and recorded them on the other side of the screen. Fast forward to 2020, 2021, and you can just auto record the Zoom recording and you get both videos all synced up. That was much nicer. But we also added in this one an in-person meeting as well. The families were generous enough that they didn't only allow us to do longitudinal Zoom videos, but they also said whenever the grandparent visited, they did a video of the grandparent and the grandchild together. And this is the type of thing that is really cognitively fascinating when you watch a child and grandparent over video. So this baby has got a Cheerio in her hand. She's 15 months old. I don't know if in Canada if Cheerios are also like the baby, food of choice. And so they're these little, I think everyone knows what Cheerios are, right? Okay, and so they give them to, she wants to give it to her granddad. So she reaches over and she gives it to her granddad, and he's looking like he's got it, but she's not entirely sure. So she goes around behind it and then reaches in over just to make sure he definitely has his Cheerio. So we don't know really, is this perspective taking? Does she really believe that this Cheerio has gone through the screen or not? Is she pretending with him? But she's having this very, very rich interaction with her granddad. Then her mum says, where is granddad? And where does he live? And she points to the screen and she says, there. And the mother's saying, no, remember, we went to his house, because this is all before the pandemic. And she said, no, he's right in the screen, right there. So there is definitely difficulty with understanding what is actually going on in this interaction that is different from face-to-face interaction, but it's clearly a very contingent one. Children make up for loss of contact with other people. They definitely engage in affection with other people over screens. And the thing that we became really interested in is how do they share information? So you might see here, this is a space shuttle toy, and the boy is trying to show over the phone. Now you can see there's a slight problem with this, right? So the person on the other side of the screen is just going to see a tiny bit of plastic. So what happens after this is that the parent explains you need to move the phone away so Granny can see this, and then talking about the perspective on the other side of the screen. So to share something with Granny, she has to actually be able to see something different from you. And this was quite frequent. If you've seen any babies under 2, if they can walk, they'll bring you stuff. And so it's no different when it's on a screen. Also, they were very interested, particularly if there was a dog or a cat or any other animal on the other side of the screen, they would engage in this classic joint attention to the screen. This is something that develops over this 6 to 24-month age range, and we were wondering how it developed in the context of video chat. There is a couple of problems, right? So when I look at the camera on video chat, and then I'm looking at the other person, it's all offset, right? So most of us have seen it at the top of everybody else's head very well, because we need to look up to see the camera because it's not in the right place to where we're looking at the other people on the screen. So the babies have to deal with that. But could they do it? And in fact, these are children 6 to 15 months. Some of them didn't. By the time they were 16 to 24 months, they tended to mostly bring objects to show their granny. And then by the time, and then the other half of them were able to notice the things on the other side of the screen and point to them on the other side of the screen, and also bring things to the screen. So we thought that this was a little bit more advanced, being able to do it in both directions or be interested in both directions. But this happened a lot, like 2.4 times a minute, and most of the time, both of the people on the screen knew what the other person was talking about. So I think that's pretty successful. And this is just another graphic showing this, but what I'm going to put in here is this first arrow is in live interaction and joint visual attention is when fragile joint visual attention in the real world develops. So when children start to point to things, but they need a lot of support. And this other arrow around 16 or 17 months is when children get much more advanced joint attention out in the real world. It doesn't matter if I point out there, well, nobody's gonna. Do you think that there's anything going on out there? There you go. Thank you. You looked around to see the back, so you have got advanced joint visual attention that there could be something happening behind you, right? And that happens around 18 months. So we thought that the mapping of the timing of when kids were doing things was mapping on to this other developmental trajectory and showing up in video chat as well. Then with our longitudinal data that we just collected during COVID, we were also able to look for these same behaviours again. This is sharing a crayon, and so the baby is paying attention to this crayon, and these two are pointed at each other across the screen. And what we found is that there were quite a few babies with the zoom view that we couldn't see any initiations from, and we saw within and across at the same time. So this is a partial replication of our original finding, showing that they are doing joint attention across time, and it's developing across time. We see more as they get older, and particularly more of these more complicated within and across screen types. We had very few babies in this sample, though, that exhibited both for whatever reason. And so this is we still are in preparation with this particular finding, but we think it's good to have a replication. So, and the other thing that is really important from the initial finding was that the grandparent sensitivity predicted the baby's attention to the screen. So how responsive the grandparent was what was sort of driving how likely it was that the baby would bring and share stuff from the world. So again, exactly what you would predict in a real world setting, but translated into a video chat setting. And now I just want to come back to that study that I mentioned briefly before from Tarasuk's and Kaufman's group in Australia. And what they had done is they put a baby alone with a video chat with their caregiver, or they left them alone, or they left them with a disembodied voice on a phone. So it was, sorry, I should back up. It was basically like an attachment paradigm. So the parent came in real life, the parent left, and then at the reunion, instead of actually coming back in real life, during the reunion period, they came back via video chat, baby was left alone, or they came back as a disembodied voice. And only the video chat was able to calm the baby. They were likely to engage in longer periods of contentment. So in this this COVID data set, we also wanted to know, well, what was going on in terms of how happy these babies were. So every 30 seconds, we scored everybody on the screen on a scale of responsiveness. So they were negative to positive. Clearly, these are very high positive interactions here. And we looked at their attention across time as well. And we measured how sensitive they were. So this little baby's learning to walk, and this grandparent is seeing this for the first time. They're playing peekaboo. And we looked at it also in real life interactions when they met for the first time in real life. So here's the mask, and this baby actually was a little bit tentative, and then during these meal times. So across all of these different situations. And we looked to see parent sensitivity also as a function of the pandemic. So in the US, vaccines became readily available for older people around here, February 1. And for grandparents, this graph is a little bit hard to see, but statistically, sensitivity, there's actually a U-shaped function here, and sensitivity was lowest around February 1 and increased after that. For parents, it was a different pattern. It was low, it got lower by February 1, and then it continued to decrease across 2021, probably with fatigue as the pandemic wore on for parents. So, did this sensitivity matter when you were on this video chat? And in fact, it did. So the babies were happier the more sensitive their grandparents were during those video chats, so indexed right across time. And this was even when we controlled for geographic distance, the timing of these different waves of the pandemic, whether or not they'd met in person or not. It was overall sensitivity, both in person and video chat, that predicted sensitivity. As I mentioned before, at least in the US, broadband access is not equitable to many families, and so not all families could remain connected like this. And at a time when parents were experiencing more and more fatigue, and grandparents were, the more sensitive they were, the more supportive they could be via video chat, even if they couldn't be in person. Some families were not given equitable access to that one resource. However, if there's one thing to take away from this entire talk, relationships here were the key factor. This relationship built across time, even via video chat, was enough to maintain these relationships across quite a long period, about a year of the pandemic. So that's basically where I'm going to end. I'm going to say it's very important, and everybody knows this, to communicate findings and disseminate them, but I just wanted to show that we had got some resources. So we worked with the AARP on the grandparenting work. We worked with 0 to 3 on screen sense tools that could be used for families, and we worked with Child Trends, and they have this positive parenting newsfeed, and anytime a study comes out, they can translate that into 1-minute TV segments that then can be disseminated right across national TV networks. And the reason why that's important is that most people who have a high school diploma or less get all of their news and information from TV news. So this is a really good way of disseminating TV news. And these are just 3 organisations that I think are very helpful in disseminating research well. So, what can you take away from this very long presentation? Couple of things. The digital world is complex. Our understanding of the impacts and trajectories of this is still pretty poor. We know that there are things that are affected, but long-term trajectories we still don't know enough about. They can learn, but it's challenging for them to learn, and they need to be supported. And therefore, the context of learning in this digital age is absolutely crucial. It can be technoference, it can be joint engagement that is positively enhancing, and video chat may be another way that we can promote those positive enhancing engagements. And that's it.